So imagine it's the summer of 1982.
Okay.
You've got this Turkish sponge diver, and he's swimming off the jagged coast of Kaş, Turkey, and he is deep, like over 150 feet down.
Which is incredibly deep for just a regular dive. The pressure down there is immense.
Right, exactly. The light is super dim, and as he's scanning the ocean floor, he sees something just completely bizarre. He later tells people he found what looked like metal biscuits with ears just sitting in the sand.
Metal biscuits with ears. I love that description so much.
I know, right? But he didn't know it at the time, but he hadn't just found some random old debris. He had actually stumbled onto a 3,000-year-old time capsule.
Yeah, a capsule that perfectly explains this massive cataclysmic war fought by Greek heroes.
Exactly. A story that, for centuries, we all just assumed was this bedtime fairy tale.
And honestly, it is arguably one of the most consequential underwater discoveries in human history. Because, well, what that diver actually found, it forces us to completely reevaluate the line between human imagination and physical documented history.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I know you, listening right now, you've definitely heard the myth of the Trojan War. You know the hits, right? The golden apple, the face that launched 1,000 ships, Achilles sulking in his tent, and, of course, the giant wooden horse.
The absolute classics.
Right. But today, our mission is to separate the myth from the mud. We're looking at a massive stack of sources for this deep dive into the source material. We've got recent, literal, groundbreaking archaeological reports out of northwestern Turkey.
We have deep-sea analyses of Bronze Age shipwrecks.
Yeah, and literary critiques of ancient forgotten sequels, all the way up to, 18th century political cartoons.
Yeah.
So we're going to figure out if Troy was actually real, how the hyper-connected ancient economy functioned, and how these people invented narrative technologies that we still use in Hollywood today.
And why the monsters they dreamt up are still just totally embedded in our modern psychology. What's fascinating here is that we are really hunting for the physical scaffolding behind the poetry.
Oh, I like that. Physical scaffolding.
Right. We want to understand how a very real geographical location, an incredibly lucrative trade route, and a brutally violent conflict were, transformed over centuries into a psychological template for basically all of humanity.
So to do that, I think we have to start in the dirt. Because for the longest time, the academic consensus was that Homer's city of Ilios, Troy was entirely fictional.
Just a fantasy realm like Middle-earth or Westeros.
Exactly. But then archaeologists started digging in this place called Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey. And recently, there's this Turkish team led by Professor Dr. Rüstem Aslan at Çanakkale Ansiki's Mart University. And they pulled things out of the ground that basically just torched the whole, it was just a myth theory.
They absolutely do. Because when archaeologists excavate a site like this, they don't just find one city. They find layers.
Like a cake.
Yeah, like a violently assembled layer cake, built one on top of the other over thousands of years.
Yeah.
And the layers we are specifically interested in today are known as Troy the Sixth and Troy the Eighth.
And those date to roughly 1180 BC, right?
Right, which is the exact period the late Bronze Age collapse is kicking off. And the physical evidence Dr. Aslan's team uncovered in these specific layers points to a sudden, massive, and overwhelmingly violent event. They found dozens and dozens of what we call sling stones.
Now, see, when I hear sling stones, my mind immediately goes to, David and Goliath, or maybe a kid skipping pebbles across a pond. But looking at the sources, they are incredibly specific about this. These are not just pebbles.
Oh, far from it. These are heady clay and river stones that have been deliberately and aerodynamically shaped by human hands.
Wow.
Yeah, they are roughly the size of a tennis ball, but significantly heavier. In the context of Bronze Age warfare, this was literal artillery.
Right, because if you launch that from a leather sling and you're a trained soldier, these things could achieve terrifying velocities.
Look, absolutely.
We are talking about a projectile that could easily crack a human skull or even cave in a bronze breastplate from dozens of yards away.
Exactly. The physics of a sling allow the user to generate immense centrifugal force. A skilled slinger was arguably more deadly and had better armor-penetrating capability at close range than an early archer.
That is wild.
But what is truly critical here isn't just what they found, but how and where they found them. These stones were discovered in extreme density, just mixed in with shattered weaponry, severely burned structural beams, and most chillingly, hastily buried human skeletons lying right outside the palace walls.
See, that is the detail that really gets me, because if you are defending your city and you successfully repel an attack, you don't just leave your deadliest ammunition scattered all over the blood-soaked ground, right?
You sweep the field.
Yeah, you gather up your ammo for the next inevitable fight.
You consolidate your resources. So the fact that these stones were left in the dirt right alongside unceremoniously dumped bodies, well, it indicates a few grim realities.
It means they lost.
Yes. It suggests a desperate, chaotic defense that ultimately failed. The defenders were overrun. The city was breached, looted, and burned. The stones weren't stored safely in an armory by a victorious garrison. They were dropped from the hands of dead men.
It's the archaeological footprint of a sudden, brutal destruction.
Perfectly mirroring the catastrophic fall of Troy described in the ancient Greek narratives. This was not a city that slowly faded away due to a changing climate or, shifting trade routes.
It is just a staggering thing to visualize, but I have to push back a little here, because skeptics for years have argued that even if there was a town at Hesarlik, it was tiny, just a little citadel.
Right, the hilltop village theory.
Exactly. Why would a massive coalition of Greek kings spend a decade fighting over a dusty little hilltop village? It just doesn't make logical sense.
Well, it wouldn't make sense if the city were actually tiny. But that assumption was completely shattered by the work of former chief excavator Manfred Korfmann. He led the digs there from 1987 until 2005.
And he looked outside the main walls, didn't he?
He did. Before Korfmann, archaeologists had mostly focused on the high citadel, the fortified top of the hill where the elites lived. But Korfmann started scanning and digging in the plains directly below the citadel. And he discovered that the city during that 1180 BC period was actually 15 times larger than previously thought.
15 times? Wait, we are talking about a lower city sprawling across something like 75 acres.
Precisely. And they didn't just find houses down there. They found a massive U-shaped defensive ditch encompassing this entire lower city. And it was carved directly into the solid limestone bedrock.
Okay, stop right there, because I want to make sure we really understand the mechanics of this. They didn't have steel. They had bronze pickaxes, if they were lucky, and maybe stone tools.
Right.
How do you carve a ditch into solid limestone with that? And, how big was this thing?
It was monumental. We were looking at a trench roughly 11.5 feet wide and 6.5 feet deep.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Carving that out of limestone without iron tools requires an unfathomable amount of organized human labor, time, and just raw caloric expenditure. You'd only commit that level of economic resource to a defensive structure if you have something incredibly valuable to protect.
And if you have a very real existential fear of being attacked by chariots and heavy infantry, I'm guessing?
Exactly. The ditch is specifically designed to snap the axles of war chariots before they can ever reach the city walls.
Man, it's like finding out that a comic book city, like Gotham, is actually based on a real, meticulously mapped historical town where a massive gang war actually happened.
It really is.
But dirt and ditches are one thing. The proof isn't just in the ground, it's in the paperwork of the era, too, the clay tablets.
Yes, you're referring to the Hittite diplomatic archives. This is where the physical archaeology and the linguistics just beautifully intersect to confirm what we are looking at.
Yeah, break this down for us.
So during the second millennium BC, the Hittites were a massive, highly bureaucratic empire, controlling most of central Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. Their state records, which were written in a wedge-shaped script called cuneiform, they mention a kingdom situated in northwestern Anatolia. They call this vassal state Wilusa.
The Wilusa. And this is where the linguistic drift absolutely blows my mind, because if you read Homer's Iliad in its original ancient Greek form, the word for Troy isn't Ilios, it's Wilios.
Yes. Over centuries, the Greek language evolved and dropped the W sound, which is what linguists call the digamp. So Wilios simply became Ilios.
That's crazy.
But in the Bronze Age, the names Wilios and Wilusa are effectively identical. We even have a surviving cuneiform treaty between the mighty Hittite king Muwatalli II and a local ruler of Wilusa, and his name was Alexandru.
Alexandru, which sounds suspiciously like Alexandros, which is the alternate name for Paris, the Trojan prince who supposedly started the whole war in the myth by kidnapping Helen.
It is a strikingly close parallel, and the correlations, they don't stop there. Throughout the epics, Homer rarely refers to the invading forces as Greeks. He usually calls them the Achaiwoi.
Which maps perfectly onto another geopolitical headache found in the Hittite records, right? A kingdom they called the Ahiawa.
Yes, the Ahiawa were a maritime power located to the west, and the Hittite kings constantly complained in their tablets that these guys were raiding the Anatolian coast and funding local rebellions.
So when you strip away the poetry, you basically have the Hittite records describing the Ahiwa attacking Wilusa in the 12th century BC, and on the other hand, you have Homer singing about the Achiwai attacking Wilios. It's just an undeniable linguistic fingerprint.
It really is highly compelling evidence that a kernel of immense historical truth survived in the oral poetry of the time. However, we do need to introduce some rigorous caution here.
Fair enough.
As numerous scholars and Turkish media outlets like Milliyet have pointed out in their coverage of Dr. Aslan's digs, we cannot conflate every single mythological detail with literal history. The war was real. The shattered bones, the sling stones, the burned timbers, they prove the violence. But what about the defining symbol of the war?
You mean the giant wooden horse?
Yes. There is absolutely zero archaeological trace of a wooden horse. Now, obviously, nor would we expect wood to survive 3 millennia in that topsoil. But more importantly, it is highly probable that the horse is entirely a symbolic narrative.
So no ninja Greeks hiding in a wooden belly?
Probably not. It might be a brilliant piece of Homeric fantasy, or perhaps a metaphor for a type of siege engine that they covered in damp horse hides to prevent it from catching fire. Some historians even argue it represents an earthquake.
An earthquake? How does that work?
Well, the god Poseidon was both the god of earthquakes and the creator of horses.
Yeah.
So a wooden horse might symbolize an earthquake that breached the walls and allowed the Greeks inside. But a literal wooden statue filled with special forces, soldiers. That is where history likely ends and narrative technology begins.
Okay, I concede the horse might just be a metaphor, but I have to push back on the core motivation of this entire conflict.
God.
Homer wants us to believe that this 10-year grinding apocalyptic war was fought because one guy kidnapped a beautiful queen. I mean, come on. Even in the Bronze Age, kings don't bankrupt their economies and sit in tents on a beach for a decade over romance.
Nice.
If this was a real, sprawling 75-acre city with a massive ditch, what was really going on? Was this just about controlling the toll booths of the ancient world?
Your skepticism is entirely warranted here. Geopolitics rarely run on romance. You have to look at a map. Troy or Wilusa sits right at the entrance to the Dardanelles. This is this narrow, treacherous strait of water that serves as the only gateway between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea.
It is literally the hinge between Europe and Asia.
It is the ultimate choke point. In an era before motorized vessels, ships that relied on sails and oars often had to wait in the bay for weeks, sometimes even months, for the prevailing winds to shift so they could actually navigate the strait safely.
Ah, a captive audience.
Exactly. And while they waited, the kings of Troy could levy massive taxes, they could demand exorbitant harbor fees, and effectively control the flow of precious metals, grain, and slaves.
So controlling Wilusa meant controlling the global supply chain.
Precisely. The abduction of Helen makes for a breathtaking song for a bard to sing by a fire, but taxation, trade monopolies, and access to raw materials, that is what actually launches fleets.
Which sets up our next major question perfectly. If we want to understand why this choke point was so insanely valuable, and why the Hayawa, the Greeks, were willing to bleed for 10 years just to control it, we have to look away from the burned dirt. We have to look at the oceans.
Yes.
We have to understand the actual physical economy that was floating on the water during the era of these supposed heroes.
And to do that, we return to our sponge diver in 1982, surfacing with news of those metal biscuits off the coast of Turkey.
Right. So he swims up, he tells his captain, and word eventually gets to the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, the INA, and they realize he hasn't just found random scrap metal, he had discovered the Uluburun shipwreck.
A monumental find.
Truly. And based on the artifacts, this ship went down roughly around 1320 BC, which places it squarely in the late Bronze Age, right in the geopolitical sweet spot before the Trojan War. But getting to this ship was not easy, was it?
No, it was an agonizingly difficult and dangerous excavation. The wreck was perched on this steep underwater slope, with the deepest parts resting at over 150 feet below the surface. And at that depth, nautical archaeologists face severe limitations.
Because of decompression sickness, right, the bends.
Precisely. Breathing compressed air at 150 feet means nitrogen is forced into your bloodstream. If you stay too long or come up too fast, the nitrogen forms bubbles in your blood. It is agonizing and potentially fatal.
Terrifying.
Because of this, the divers could only work on the actual wreck for about 20 minutes a day.
20 minutes a day?
Yes. It required extreme discipline. They used underwater vacuums to carefully clear the sand, meticulously mapping every single item on a grid before they could even think about lifting it. Due to these constraints, it took the INA team 11 agonizingly slow seasons, logging over 22,000 individual dives to fully excavate the site.
22,000 dives. The sheer logistics of that are just mind-boggling. But when you look at the inventory they brought up from the dark, you realize exactly why they spent over a decade doing it. It is nothing short of a time capsule that completely rewrote our understanding of the ancient global economy.
It really did.
So let's break down the cargo. First, the divers' metal biscuits with ears.
Ah, yes. Those were copper oxide ingots.
Okay, explain the shape to us because oxide sounds like leather, not metal.
Right. The term oxide refers to the shape of the ingot, not the material. Imagine a large, heavy rectangle of raw copper weighing roughly 60 pounds. But the four corners are stretched out so they look like the legs of a stretched ox skin.
Okay, I can picture that.
Those four extended corners are the ears the diver saw. And they were cast this way entirely for ergonomics. The shape made it significantly easier for stevedores to lift the heavy metal onto their shoulders. Plus, it allowed the ingots to be stacked securely in the curved hull of a ship without sliding around and doing damage during a storm.
That is just brilliant engineering just for the packaging, and the ship was absolutely loaded with them. The sources say they found 354 of these copper ingots, which totals about 10 tons of raw copper.
10 tons. It's incredible.
But it wasn't just copper. They also found a massive amount of tin ingots. And the ratio between the copper and the tin is basically the smoking gun for what this ship was actually doing.
Yes, they found roughly 1 ton of tin. This means the ship was carrying copper and tin in a very precise 10-to-1 ratio.
Okay, I was never great at chemistry, but why does that specific ratio matter so much? Was it just like a currency standard or something?
No, it is far more practical than that. 10 parts copper to 1 part tin is the exact optimal metallurgical recipe for creating bronze.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah. See, copper alone is too soft for heavy combat. A copper sword will literally bend when it hits a shield. Tin alone, on the other hand, is too brittle, it will just shatter. But when you smelt them together at a 10-to-1 ratio, you create an alloy that is incredibly hard, retains a razor-sharp edge, and can be cast into very complex shapes.
So the ship wasn't just carrying metal, it was essentially a floating military-industrial complex.
Precisely. It carried the exact raw materials required to equip an entire army with weapons and armor.
Which proves exactly why controlling trade routes like Troy was so vital. If you cut off the tin supply, which it had to be imported from very far away.
Yeah.
Your enemy literally cannot make weapons.
They're defenseless.
Right. But the Uluburun ship wasn't just hauling military supplies. The luxury goods they pulled out of the sand read like the treasure hoard of a dragon.
The sheer opulence of the secondary cargo is staggering. For instance, they recovered a unique, solid gold scarab inscribed with the royal cartouche of Nefertiti, the famous Egyptian queen.
That's insane.
It is. And that single artifact helped them firmly date the wreck, and it proved the ship was interacting with the highest echelons of Egyptian royalty.
And they also found carved ivory from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, raw ebony logs from Africa. They had ostrich eggshells that had been converted into these ornate vases, faience beads, which is this beautiful ancient type of glazed ceramic. And they found 149 of what they call Canaanite jars.
Amphora. These were essentially the standard shipping containers of the ancient Mediterranean.
Right. And through modern chemical residue analysis, they figured out what was inside them, which is so cool. Each of these jars held about 6.7 liters, and they were mostly filled with terebinth resin.
Yes. Terebinth is the sap from a species of pistachio tree. In antiquity, it was massively valuable. It was used as a base for high-end perfumes, as an incense in religious rituals, and the Egyptians used vast quantities of it in their mummification processes.
They even found musical instruments on the wreck, like they recovered the remains of lutes that had sound boxes made entirely out of tortoise shells. It's just an incredibly vibrant picture of life.
It gives you such a human connection to the crew.
It really does. And the technology of the ship itself is equally impressive. I need you to explain this to me because the sources mention it was built using pegged mortise and tenon joints. I'm not a shipwright. How is that different from just, nailing some cedar planks together?
It is a fundamentally different and highly advanced approach to woodworking. In later periods, ships were often what we call clinker built, where the planks overlap and are nailed together. But the Uluburun ship, which was built of Lebanese cedar, used mortise and tenon.
Okay, so how does that work?
Imagine carving a deep rectangular slot, that's the mortise, into the edge of one thick wooden plank. Then you carve a macking slot into the next plank. You insert a small piece of hardwood, the tenon, into both slots, effectively locking the planks together edge to edge.
Oh, I see.
Then, to make sure it never slips, You drill a hole through the plank and the tenon, and you hammer a wooden peg right through it.
Wait, so there are no metal nails holding the hull together at all?
None. The entire hull is an interlocking puzzle of wood. And here's the genius part. When the cedar hits the seawater, it swells. This makes the joints incredibly tight and entirely watertight.
That is so smart.
Crucially, this method allows the hull to flex slightly as it rides over the massive waves of the Mediterranean, rather than rigidly snapping under the immense stress of a heavy cargo. They also utilized a proto-keel, which is essentially an early version of the heavy-bottom timber that gives a ship deep structural integrity and prevents it from being easily blown sideways by the wind.
So we have this absolute masterwork of engineering, loaded with goods from all over the known world. And based on the personal effects found on board, the archaeologists believe the crew was mostly Syro-Canaanite, so from the Levant region, but they also had Mycenaean Greek passengers on board too.
Yes, a very diverse group.
Which just proves the Mediterranean wasn't a bunch of isolated xenophobic islands. It was a heavily hyper-connected, globalized economy. Kings and merchants were exchanging exotic goods across vast distances. That is the physical reality of the world the Trojan War happened in. But here is where the story gets really weird when we compare the dirt and the shipwrecks to Homer's poetry.
Ah, you're referring to the narrative anachronisms.
Yes.
Okay.
Because Homer's storytelling acts like a glitching time machine. He constantly mixes up different eras of history. For example, in the Iliad, he spends a lot of time describing warriors using these massive tower shields made of layers of oxhide that covered the whole body from neck to ankle. Archaeologically, those are strictly Bronze Age weapons. They belong to the era of the Ulubaran ship. But then, in the very next breath, Homer talks about heroes fighting with iron weapons. And he talks about the great geopolitical power of a kingdom called Phrygia.
Which presents a massive historical contradiction. Because during the Bronze Age, when the war supposedly happened, iron weapons were virtually non-existent on the battlefield. Everything was bronze. Furthermore, Phrygia was a relatively weak, unorganized region during the Bronze Age. It only rose to become a mighty, influential kingdom centuries later, around the 8th century BC.
Which, conveniently, happens to be the exact time period when Homer's poems were finally being written down, so the epic is a massive mashup.
It is. Think of it like this. If we use a modern analogy, the transmission of the Homeric epics was essentially like open-source software code.
I like where this is going.
These poems weren't written down in 1180 BC. They were sung. They were passed down by specialized bards, called rhapsodes, for roughly 400 years in a purely oral tradition before the Greek alphabet was widely adopted. So every new generation of bards would essentially update the code.
They'd tweak it for their audience.
Exactly. They would keep the core story, the wrath of Achilles, the fall of Troy, but they would weave in details from their own contemporary world to keep the audience engaged and make it relatable.
So it's like someone today telling a story about the American Revolution, but to make it relatable, they mention George Washington coordinating troop movements on a smartphone while still insisting he's riding a horse.
That is a perfect, if slightly absurd, parallel. The epic acts as a sedimentary rock of history. You have a 12th century BC geopolitical conflict fought with Bronze Age tower shields, but it's described using 8th century BC Iron Age weaponry and shifting regional alliances.
I really love that visual, a sedimentary rock of poetry, but it makes me wonder, if they had all this advanced maritime trade back in 1320 BC with precise pegged mortise and tenon shipbuilding and incredibly well-established trade routes crisscrossing the Mediterranean, why in the world did it take Odysseus 10 entire years to navigate home from Troy to Ithaca? I mean, look at a map. Was he just a terrible captain who refused to ask for directions?
That is the enduring joke among modern sailors who read the Odyssey. Geographically speaking, the trip from the Dardanelles down through the Aegean and over to the Ionian island Ithaca shouldn't take a decade, even with the most catastrophically bad weather.
Right.
But we connect this to the bigger picture. The epic is less about literal maritime navigation and much, much more about a psychological and narrative journey. The physical reality of the Bronze Age was complex, yes, but the story of Odysseus is an exploration of the obstacles inherent in the human condition.
Which is a brilliant pivot, because keeping a story alive for 400 years through an oral game of telephone, without it falling apart into total gibberish, requires more than just a really good memory. The ancient Greeks needed some highly advanced narrative technology to keep audiences hooked.
They absolutely did. They developed sophisticated literary devices that we still rely on in almost every novel, television show, and blockbuster movie today.
Let's dig into the toolbox Homer was working with. First up, In medias res. This means starting the story right in the middle of the action. When you crack open the Odyssey, you don't start at the end of the Trojan War with Odysseus packing his bags and getting on a ship.
No, you skip all that.
You start years later. You start on Ithaca with his teenage son Telemachus completely overwhelmed by a house full of arrogant, violent suitors eating all their food. And Odysseus is entirely absent, trapped on an island with a nymph. It immediately hooks you because you want to know how things got this bad.
Exactly. It creates immediate dramatic tension. But to fill in the missing context without ruining the pacing with a dry prologue, Homer masterfully employs another technique, the flashback. We don't get an omniscient, objective narrator simply listing what happened to the fleet. We get Odysseus himself, having washed up on the shores of the highly civilized Phaeacians, sitting at a lav banquet and recounting his own past traumas.
He tells them about the Cyclops, the Sirens, the journey to the underworld.
Yes, and by having the protagonist narrate his own backstory, the author manipulates the passage of time and forces the audience to experience the terror and grief directly through the eyes of the survivor.
And when the plot gets so tangled that it seems literally impossible to resolve, like when Odysseus is facing down the families of the suitors he just slaughtered at the end of the epic cup, Homer deploys the Deus ex machina, the god from the machine.
A classic trope.
Yeah. The gods, usually Athena, literally drop into the scene to magically solve unfixable problems, command peace, or change the weather. It was basically the CGI special effects budget of the ancient world.
It resolved narrative dead ends, yes, but it also reinforced the ancient worldview that human affairs were constantly subject to divine intervention. But what many casual readers don't realize today is that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were not standalone works. They did not exist in a vacuum. They are just two surviving pieces of a massive 8-part collection known as the epic cycle.
This completely blew my mind when I was reading the sources. The Greeks had a whole cinematic universe going on.
They really did.
The epic cycle included works we only have fragments or summaries of today. There was the Cypria, which covered the entire buildup to the war, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, and the judgment of Paris. There was the Ethiopis, which picked up right after the Iliad and covered the arrival of the Amazonian queens and the tragic death of Achilles.
And the Nostoi, which followed the other Greek kings trying to get home.
Right. But the most bizarre part of this whole ancient franchise is the lost sequel to the Odyssey.
Ah, the Telegony.
The Telegony, attributed to a poet named Eugamon of Cyrene, written much later, roughly in the mid-6th century BC. Now, before we get into the absolutely wild plot of this sequel, we have to talk about who Eugamon was and where he lived, because the geography deeply influences the story he tells.
Context is everything here. Cyrene was an incredibly wealthy Greek colony located in North Africa and what is modern-day Libya. It was founded around 630 BC by a leader named Battus I. By the time Eugamon was writing, during the reign of Battus II, Cyrene was experiencing a massive economic boom.
And what were they getting rich on? It wasn't gold or copper, it was a plant, a wild weed called silphium, and the ancient world was utterly obsessed with it.
Silphium is one of the most fascinating ecological mysteries of antiquity. It grew almost exclusively in a narrow strip of the North African coastal plains around Cyrene. It resisted all attempts at farming or cultivation. It had to be harvested wild, and the demand was insatiable.
They used the stalks for cooking, they used the resin for high-end perfumes, but most importantly, they used the seeds for medicine. The sources suggest it was highly effective as a contraceptive and an abortifacient. It was so valuable to the Roman and Greek economies that it was literally worth its weight in silver.
Unbelievable.
Cyrene actually stamped the image of the silphium plant on their coins. It eventually went completely extinct because they over-harvested it to death.
Because of this immense monopoly on silphium, Cyrene became a vibrant, incredibly wealthy hybrid city. It blended traditional Greek culture with the local Libyan and North African customs. This rich environment allowed for the extensive patronage of the arts, including funding poets to write and perform epic poetry.
So they had the cash to support the art.
Exactly. The epic cycle functioned as a massive interconnected mythology that rhapsodes could perform sequentially at major pan-Hellenic festivals like the Pannonia or the Panathenaic Games in Athens. And Eugamon's contribution, the Telegony, was specifically designed to serve as the definitive grand finale to the entire Trojan saga.
And what a finale it is. Prepare yourself because the plot is completely unhinged compared to what we are used to. So, The Odyssey ends with Odysseus finally getting home, right? He slaughters the suitors, reunites with his faithful wife Penelope, and we all assume it's happily ever after.
Yeah.
Except the Telegony comes along and says, nope, he gets bored and leaves again. The poem details Odysseus traveling to a place called Thesprotia, marrying a queen named Callides, and leading her army in a massive war against a tribe called the Brygians.
He essentially abandons Ithaca to start a completely new life. He even fathers another son, named Polypoetes, with the Thesprotian queen, while Penelope is presumably just sitting back in Ithaca waiting for him all over again.
It totally undercuts the romance of the Odyssey. But wait, it gets so much crazier. While Odysseus is off fighting this new war, Telegonus enters the picture. Telegonus is the illegitimate son Odysseus had with the witch goddess Circe during his long journey home. Telegonus grows up on his mother's magic island and eventually sets out to find his famous father. He lands on the shores of Ithaca and, not realizing where he is, starts raiding the island and stealing cattle for food. Odysseus, who has since returned to Ithaca after Queen Callides passes away, rushes out with his armor to defend his island from this pirate.
And here we encounter the classic tragic trope of unrecognized kinship.
Exactly. They are wearing armor, they don't recognize each other. Father and son clash on the beach. They fight brutally, and Telegonus strikes Odysseus with a spear. But it's not a regular bronze spear. The tip is fashioned from the venomous barb of a stingray, and the great Odysseus, survivor of Troy, slayer of monsters, dies in the sand.
I know it sounds bizarre to modern ears, but this specific death is actually the inexorable fulfillment of a chilling prophecy.
Oh, from the underworld.
Yes. In the 11th book of the Odyssey, when Odysseus journeys to the underworld, the blind prophet Tiresias tells him that his eventual death will come out of the sea. A spear tipped with a stingray barb perfectly and tragically fulfills that oracle in a way that a simple drowning would not. The biological toxicity of a stingray's venom makes it a genuinely lethal weapon.
Okay, I can appreciate the cleverness of fulfilling the prophecy, but the ending is what makes me question everything. So Telegonus realizes, to his horror, that he just killed his own father. He's devastated. He takes Odysseus' corpse, along with his dad's grieving widow Penelope and his half-brother Telemachus. They all get on a ship and sail back to Circe's magic island, Aea,
where Circe uses her divine magic to grant all of them immortality.
And then they get married. Telegonus, the son of Circe, marries his dead father's widow, Penelope, and Telemachus, the son of Penelope, marries his dead father's ex-lover, the witch, Circe. Wait, seriously?
Yes, that is the ending.
The epic saga of Western literature, the foundation of our heroic myths, ends with a stingray spear accident and a double marriage that sounds like a reality TV show gone horribly wrong. Did the Greeks actually accept this as canon?
It is undeniably jarring to our modern sensibilities.
Yeah.
But from an ancient structural perspective, it serves a very specific purpose. It neatly ties up all the loose ends of the heroic age. By making them immortal, it transitions the mortal heroes out of the messy human world and into the permanent realm of the divine.
Okay, I can sort of see that.
Furthermore, it unifies the divergent, messy bloodlines of Odysseus into a single immortal family unit. Scholars also note that Eugamon incorporated specific North African geographical elements and motifs into the text, demonstrating how the epic tradition was constantly adapting to reflect the local colonial identities of places like Cyrene.
But wasn't there a massive scandal attached to this poem? I read that people didn't even think Eugamon wrote it.
You're referring to the plagiarism accusation levied centuries later.
Yes. The early Christian writer Clement of Alexandria straight up accused Eugamon of stealing the entire poem. He claimed Eugamon ripped off a legendary older poet named Musaeus, stole his plot, and just slapped his own name on the telegony.
We have to view Clement's accusation through the heavily biased lens of his own ideological agenda. Clement was an early Christian theologian writing around 200 AD. He frequently sought to discredit pagan writers and Hellenistic literary traditions in order to assert the moral and historical superiority of Christian texts.
So he had an ulterior motive.
Absolutely. He routinely portrayed Greek philosophers and poets as derivative thieves who plagiarized older, sometimes biblical sources.
So you think it was just a theological smear campaign?
It is highly probable. You have to remember that in the oral tradition of the epic cycle, taking a shared culturally foundational story and performing it or recording it, it wasn't considered plagiarism in the modern legal copyright sense. It was the standard method of artistic transmission. You were supposed to retell the great stories.
It's just fascinating that thousands of years ago, they were having the exact same arguments about canon, unnecessary sequels, and intellectual property that we have on internet forums about blockbuster movie franchises today.
Human nature hasn't changed much.
Not at all. But to understand why a character like Odysseus was so vital to the culture that they were writing wild sequels about him centuries later, we have to look past the monsters and the magic. We have to look at what he actually represented to the Greeks.
And that requires examining the deeply rooted psychology of his journey.
The driving force behind the entire Odyssey, the reason the story exists, is anchored in a single Greek concept, nostos.
Nostos translates roughly to homecoming, or the perilous return journey, is the etymological root of the English word nostalgia, which literally means the pain or the ache of wanting to return home.
But for Odysseus, nostos isn't just about physically walking through his front door and sitting in his favorite chair. It is a massive, grueling psychological transition. He spent 10 years fighting a brutal, muddy, blood-soaked war at Troy.
A war that changed him fundamentally.
Right. He has been defined entirely by his capacity for violence, his cunning, and his ability to survive by killing others. To truly go home, he has to shed that psychological armor. He has to figure out how to transition from a warlord back into a peacetime husband, a father, and the head of a civilized, functioning household.
That transition is rarely seamless. It requires him to relearn and navigate the rules of civilized society. And in ancient Greece, the absolute bedrock of civilization was the concept of xenia, or guest friendship, hospitality.
This was a big deal back then.
Huge. In a world without hotels, police forces, or international embassies, the guest-host relationship was sacred. It was protected by Zeus himself. If you were traveling and knocked on a door, the host was obligated to take you in, feed you, and protect you. In return, the guest was obligated not to abuse the host's generosity.
And Odysseus essentially spends the entire epic auditing the ancient world on this exact concept. Every island he lands on is a test of xenia. Sometimes the hosts fail catastrophically, like the Cyclops, Polyphemus.
Classic example of bad hospitality.
Yeah, he represents the ultimate terrifying violation of hospitality because instead of welcoming Odysseus and feeding his guests, he traps them in a cave and literally eats them. He is the antithesis of civilization.
Contrast that barbaric behavior with the highly civilized Phaeacians later in the epic. When Odysseus washes up naked and starving on their shores, they don't interrogate him or enslave him. They immediately welcome him, bathe him in warm oil, feed him lavish feasts, and bestow incredible gifts of gold and bronze upon him before providing a magical ship to grant him safe passage home.
They're like the gold standard.
They represent the pinnacle of xenia.
But the ultimate test of hospitality happens in his own home. Odysseus finally arrives in Ithaca, but he doesn't announce himself. He disguises himself as an old, withered beggar to test the suitors who have moved into his palace. These are local noblemen who are eating his food, drinking his wine, and harassing his wife Penelope to marry one of them.
And they fail the test.
They fail the hospitality test spectacularly.
Yeah.
They mock the beggar, they threw a stool at him, they refuse him food. They are the ultimate bad house guests who refuse to leave. So what does this all mean? Well, it proves a profound point. The real monsters at the end of the Odyssey aren't magical creatures with one eye or witches who turn men into pigs. The final monsters are humans who violate the social contract.
That is a brilliant distillation of the epic's core theme. The mythological monsters serve as physical, terrifying manifestations of societal fears, psychological barriers, and very real navigational hazards. Let's look closely at one specific famous trial Odysseus faces, which perfectly illustrates this blend of geography and psychology, the passage between Scylla and Charybdis.
Oh, this is a classic nightmare scenario. Odysseus has to sail his fragile wooden ship through a narrow, treacherous strait. On one side of the water is Scylla. Homer describes her as a horrifying monster with 6 long necks and 6 heads filled with rows of fangs sitting high up on a cliff face.
Terrifying imagery.
Yeah, she swoops down and snatches exactly 6 of his men from the deck. But on the other side of the strait is Charybdis, a massive, swirling whirlpool that sucks down the ocean and spits it back out. If the ship gets caught in Charybdis, the entire vessel is dragged to the bottom and everyone dies.
Geographically, ancient scholars and modern geographers alike cite these monsters at the Strait of Messina. This is the incredibly narrow passage of water that separates the island of Sicily from the region of Calabria on the toe of the Italian mainland.
So they took a real navigational nightmare, a dangerous rock shoal on one side and treacherous swirling ocean currents on the other, and turned them into literal monsters to explain the terror to audiences back home.
Precisely. Scylla was the mythological personification of the jagged rocky shoals on the Calabrian side that would rip the hull out of a ship. Charybdis was the personification of the tidal whirlpools that form off the coast of Sicily, created where the differing currents of the Ionian and Tyrrhenian seas violently collide.
It's a literal death trap.
They represented a lethal maritime hazard, where attempting to avoid one danger meant drifting inevitably into the jaws of the other. Odysseus is forced to make a harrowing, agonizing leadership decision. He chooses to sail his ship closer to the rocks of Scylla. He accepts the tragic, guaranteed loss of 6 of his best men to save the rest of the crew and the ship from total annihilation in the whirlpool. He must consciously choose the lesser of 2 evils.
And that concept of an impossible choice resonated so deeply with human psychology that between Scylla and Charybdis became an idiom that has survived for over 3,000 years. It's wild to trace how this specific phrase evolved through history long after people stopped believing in 6-headed monsters.
It truly is a remarkable cultural through line. We see it recorded prominently by the great Renaissance humanist Erasmus in his 1515 work Adagia. He was compiling ancient proverbs, and he quoted a 12th century Latin poet, Walter of Chadillon, noting the inherent human tragedy that in wishing to desperately avoid Charybdis, one often stumbles blindly right into Scylla.
It means trying so hard to overcorrect and avoid one extreme that you fall directly into the opposite extreme. And because of that, it became a favorite, enduring metaphor for political polarization. We see this vividly in a famous 1793 political cartoon by the British satirist James Gilray.
Yes.
He drew Britannia steering a ship labeled the Constitution. On one side, the Rock of Scylla is depicted as the chaos of the French Revolution, an extreme, unchecked democracy, topped with a liberty cap. On the other side, the whirlpool of Charybdis is drawn as arbitrary, absolute, monarchical power, symbolized by an inverted crown. And to be clear, we are just imparting the historical context of this art, not endorsing any underlying politics.
Absolutely. And looking at that cartoon as a historical artifact, it is fascinating to see how Gilray used the Homeric myth to perfectly illustrate the intense political anxieties of Britain at the time. The leadership was terrified, attempting to navigate a safe middle path during the ideological upheaval of the French Revolution without succumbing to either the chaos of the mob or the tyranny of a dictator.
And we see the exact same Homeric metaphor deployed in the United States. Decades later, in 1863, the British magazine Punch published a cartoon by John Tenniel. It shows the UK Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, gripping the wheel of a ship named Neutrality during the height of the American Civil War.
Another impossible situation.
Exactly. The craggy, dangerous rock of Scylla is drawn with the face of Abraham Lincoln, and the churning, deadly whirlpool of Charybdis is drawn as Jefferson Davis. And again, as observers of historical art, we're just looking at how the artist portrayed this.
It is the same visual vocabulary. The British leadership felt precariously caught between the 2 warring American factions. Tenniel used Homer's ancient sea monsters to symbolize the absolute peril of being drawn into the conflict on either side, advocating for a desperate, steady hand on the wheel to maintain neutrality.
The idiom just permeates everything. The author Victor Hugo used it in his epic novel Les Miserables to describe the impossible choices faced at the barricades during the Paris uprising. James Joyce structured an entire, incredibly dense chapter of his modernist masterpiece, Ulysses, around the concept of navigating between rigid dogma and formless thought. It even made its way into 1980s pop culture.
Indeed, the heavy metal band Trivium wrote a song utilizing the imagery, and arguably, much more famously, the Police used the exact phrase in their 1983 hit single, Wrapped Around Your Finger.
Yes, Sting is on the radio singing about being caught between Scylla and Charybdis as a metaphor for being trapped in a dangerous, controlling, manipulative relationship. We take a real jagged rock and a real swirling whirlpool from the Mediterranean Sea, turn them into 6-headed sea monsters in a Bronze Age epic song, and 3,000 years later, they are political cartoons about the Civil War and rock songs about relationship anxiety.
Which tells us something profound about why we tell stories. It means that Homer's physical obstacles transformed seamlessly into psychological and political metaphors. The journey of Odysseus endures not because we care about Bronze Age sailing routes, but because humanity is constantly struggling to find a middle path.
That's incredibly well said.
We are constantly trying to navigate safely between dangerous extremes in a polarized world. The monsters change their faces depending on the century, but the treacherous strait we all have to sail through remains exactly the same.
Which brings us perfectly to our conclusion. Listen, we have covered an unbelievable amount of ground on this deep dive into the source material. We started by getting our hands dirty with the literal physical dirt of Turkey, holding cracked skulls and aerodynamic clay slingstones that prove the cataclysmic violence of the Trojan War wasn't just a fairy tale.
We sailed on the Uluburun ship, a hyper-connected Bronze Age time capsule, exploring how 10 tons of copper and a gold scarab, the geopolitical realities and the complex metallurgy that funded those ancient conflicts.
We read the bizarre, lost reality TV-style sequel of a Cyrenian poet who funded his art with a birth control weed and who may or may not have plagiarized the whole thing from an older bard. And we traced a six-headed monster from a terrifying navigational hazard in Italy all the way to a pop song on the radio.
The evolution of these narratives demonstrates the incredible durability of human storytelling. We encode our harsh economic realities, our historical traumas, and our deepest psychological fears into myth, ensuring that the lessons survive long after the empire's fall.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering thought for you to chew on today. We just spent an hour decoding how the ancient Greeks hid real gang wars over toll booths, actual heavily trafficked trade routes, and literal navigational hazards inside epic poems full of gods, magic, and monsters. So think about the stories we tell today. Think about our massive blockbuster movies, our sprawling superhero cinematic universes, our apocalyptic sci-fi epics. What will archaeologists 3,000 years from now think when they dig up our server farms and our comic books? Will they think we literally believed in people flying in capes and shooting lasers from their eyes? Or will they be able to decode the very real societal anxieties, the political polarization, the fear of technology, and the desperate hopes for a savior that we hid inside our modern myths? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Stay curious and keep questioning the stories you were told. Until next time.